the Atlantic slave trade, 16th to 19th century, over 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas. The Middle Passage had a 15 to 20% mortality rate due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Some slave ships threw sick or dying captives overboard to collect insurance money. Enslaved Africans were often branded with the initials of their owners or the trading company. European traders exchanged enslaved people for goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol. In Charleston, South Carolina, 40% of all enslaved Africans entered through its ports. The largest slave market in the Americas was in New Orleans, where families were often torn apart. Many enslaved Africans resisted by jumping overboard from slave ships. Some African kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Dahomey, grew rich by selling captives to European traders. Enslaved people were often displayed naked at auctions to be inspected like livestock. Some enslaved people were force-fed if they refused to eat to avoid starvation deaths. Over 500,000 enslaved people were transported to the United States, while Brazil received 4.9 million. The Portuguese were responsible for transporting the largest number of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Ships designed for cargo were often modified to cram hundreds of captives into tight spaces. The British Abolition Act of 1807 banned the transatlantic slave trade, but illegal smuggling continued. Some enslaved Africans committed suicide rather than face a lifetime of slavery. Rebellions occurred aboard slave ships, such as the famous Amistad Revolt, 1839. European slavers often encouraged rival African groups to capture and sell their enemies. The Barracoon system held enslaved people in coastal forts before they were shipped overseas. Some captives endured months or even years in holding cells before being sold. Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal was a major slave trading post with a door of no return. Many enslaved women were raped by slave traders before being sold. Enslaved children were often cheaper and sold separately from their families. Some slave traders made millions from trafficking enslaved people, equivalent to modern billionaires. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. The Islamic Slave Trade, 7th–19th century. The Arab slave trade lasted over 1,300 years, longer than the transatlantic trade. Many enslaved Africans were taken across the Sahara Desert in brutal conditions. The Zanzibar slave market was one of the largest in East Africa. Castration was common for male enslaved people, leading to a high mortality rate. Many enslaved people were forced to work in salt mines, which had extremely high death rates. Some were used as soldiers, such as the Ottoman Janissaries, who were enslaved as children. The Islamic world enslaved millions of Europeans, especially through raids in the Mediterranean. Enslaved women were often sold as concubines in Middle Eastern harems. Some enslaved people became powerful, like the Mamluks of Egypt, who ruled as a military caste. Slave markets in the Ottoman Empire were called esir pazara, prisoner markets. White European women were especially sought after in North African slave markets. Some enslaved African boys were forced into royal courts as eunuchs. The Barbary pirates captured over 1 million Europeans and sold them into slavery. Some enslaved people in the Middle East worked as galley slaves, rowing for life on warships. The Sakaliba were enslaved Slavic people who were traded across the Islamic world. Islamic law technically forbade enslaving fellow Muslims, but this was often ignored. Many enslaved Africans in the Middle East had short lifespans due to harsh conditions. The Ottomans ran slave markets in Constantinople, which lasted until the 19th century. Some enslaved people in North Africa were ransomed back to their home countries. The last legal slave market in Saudi Arabia was only shut down in 1962. Ancient Roman and Greek slave markets. The Roman economy relied on millions of enslaved people, especially for farming and mining. Enslaved people in Rome were displayed on stone platforms with signs listing their skills. Ancient Delos, Greece, was one of the busiest slave markets, trading 10,000 enslaved people per day. Enslaved gladiators could sometimes win their freedom, but had a 90% mortality rate in fights. Many Roman enslaved people were war captives, including defeated Carthaginians, Gauls, and Germans. Enslaved people were tattooed or branded to prevent them from escaping. The phrase "sold down the river" comes from Roman times when enslaved people were transported by boat. Rome's elite often had enslaved Greek scholars who were highly valued for their education. Enslaved people in mines had some of the shortest lifespans, often dying within a few years. Some enslaved people rebelled, such as Spartacus, whose revolt shook Rome in 73 to 71 BCE. Roman slaves could be killed at their master's whim without legal consequences. The Greek city-state of Sparta enslaved entire populations, known as helots, to work their land. Enslaved people in Athens were sometimes given important roles, like managing money for their masters. Some enslaved people were buried alive as human sacrifices in certain ancient rituals. The Roman slave market was called the Forum Servorum, where enslaved people were sold in chains. American slavery and antebellum markets, 17th to 19th century, enslaved people were advertised in newspapers with descriptions of their skills and physical condition. At peak times, New Orleans had over 1,000 enslaved people for sale in public markets. The price of an enslaved person could be over $1,200 in 1850, equal to $40,000 today. Children were often sold separately from their parents, leading to heartbreaking separations. Some enslaved people were forced to breed, increasing plantation owners' profits. Slave traders used insurance policies so they could be compensated if enslaved people died. The Fugitive Slave Act, 1850, allowed enslavers to reclaim escapees even in free states. Many free black people in the North were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Some enslaved people were forced into fight clubs where they fought for entertainment. Enslaved people were sometimes displayed in glass cages in major cities to attract buyers. The Atlantic Slave Trade. Some enslaved people were forced to dance on ship decks for exercise, often while shackled. Many ship captains preferred male slaves, believing they could endure harsh labor better. Shark populations increased along transatlantic slave routes due to bodies being thrown overboard. Some captives attempted to starve themselves, but traders used tools to force-feed them. Slavers often cut off the ears or toes of rebellious enslaved people to prevent escape. The United States continued illegal slave trading for decades after it was banned in 1808. Some abolitionists were physically attacked for opposing the slave trade. Slave ships were often designed with hidden compartments to smuggle enslaved people. The 1811 British Slave Trade Felony Act made slave trading punishable by death. Despite legal bans, human trafficking still exists today, often as forced labor. Many enslaved Africans were forced to walk thousands of miles across deserts to be sold. Some Arab slave traders deliberately targeted specific African tribes for their perceived strength. Many enslaved Africans died before reaching markets due to exhaustion and dehydration. Some enslaved people were forced to build Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cairo. In Ottoman harems, enslaved women were sometimes poisoned or executed for minor offenses. Christian and Hindu children were kidnapped and converted to Islam before being sold. The Ottoman Empire taxed slave sales, making it a major source of revenue. Some enslaved people in the Islamic world were forced to become naval slaves in imperial fleets. Arab traders controlled major slave markets in Sudan, Yemen, and Persia for centuries. The last recorded public slave auction in the Middle East was in the 20th century. The Romans often paraded captured slaves through the streets before selling them. Some enslaved people were forced to fight wild animals in colosseums for entertainment. Roman law classified slaves as property, not people, with no legal rights. Enslaved children were sometimes trained from birth to serve Roman elites. Some enslaved people became trusted advisors, despite having no legal freedom. In Greek society, enslaved people were sometimes used as police officers. Spartan slaves, helots, were routinely executed to prevent revolts. In Rome, if a master was murdered, all their enslaved people were executed as punishment. Some enslaved minors were chained permanently to prevent escape. Roman elites sometimes bet on gladiator slaves, treating them like racehorses. Some enslaved people were forced to whistle while serving food so they wouldn't steal. Enslaved women were often forced to breastfeed their enslavers' children instead of their own. Enslaved people were sometimes branded on the face to discourage escape attempts. Some slave traders drugged enslaved people before auctions to make them appear healthier. The largest U.S. slave market was in New Orleans, with thousands sold yearly. Enslaved people who tried to escape were hunted by bloodhounds. Many enslaved people were forced to dig their own graves before execution. Some were forced into fancy girl auctions, where they were sold for sexual exploitation. The South's economy was built on slave labor, producing cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Even after slavery was abolished, black codes and convict leasing continued forced labor, slave resistance, and revolts. Many enslaved people fought back, despite the brutal consequences of rebellion. The Haitian Revolution, from 1791 to 1804, was the most successful slave revolt, leading to Haiti's independence. Some enslaved people poisoned their enslavers as a form of resistance. The Stono Rebellion, in 1739 in South Carolina, saw enslaved people kill white settlers and attempt to escape to Spanish Florida. Maroon communities were formed by escaped enslaved people in the Americas and the Caribbean. Some rebellions were punished by mass executions, with rebels burned alive or hanged. The Amistad Revolt saw enslaved Africans seize control of a slave ship and attempt to sail back to Africa. The Zanj Rebellion, 9th century CE, involved thousands of enslaved East Africans rebelling against the Abbasid Caliphate. Enslaved people in the US developed codes in their songs to communicate escape plans. Some enslaved women terminated pregnancies to prevent their children from being born into slavery. Economic impact of slavery.